Hi, Miss Moskowitz here, ready to read Chapter 1 of Into the Primitive from Jack London's Call the Wild. You'll see that in the beginning of the chapter, there's a short piece of poetry verse that's right here. It says, Old longings, nomadic leap, chafing at custom's chain, again from its brumal sleep, wakens the ferine strain. So basically this means that some of us, animals, people, have something inside of us that's just wild and extreme. And they just can't resist the call to drive cross country or climb mountains or take a trip somewhere. And with animals, if you've ever had a pet who really likes to roam and doesn't like to stay in the yard, you might know what we're talking about. So the point of view of this story is first person point of view told from Buck's perspective. Buck is a dog. So Buck did not read newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, not alone for himself, but for every Tidewater dog, strong of muscle and with warm, long hair from Puget Sound to San Diego. Because men, groping in the Arctic darkness, had found a yellow metal, that would be gold, and because steamship and transportation companies were booming the find, thousands of men were rushing into the Northland. These men wanted dogs, and the dogs they wanted were heavy dogs, with strong muscles by which to toil, and furry coats to protect them from the frost. So this whole part is talking about the gold rush to Alaska, which is often referred to as the Klondike Gold Rush. Buck lived at a big house in a sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. Judge Miller's place it was called. It stood back from the road, half hidden among the trees, through which glimpses could be caught of the wide, cool veranda that ran around its four sides. A veranda is a porch, by the way. The house was approached by gravel driveways, which wound about through wide-spreading lawns and over the interlacing boughs or branches on trees, of tall poplars. At the rear, things were on even a more spacious scale than in the front. Spacious means wide and lots of room. There's great stables where a dozen grooms and boys held forth, rows of vine-clad servants' cottages, an endless array of outhouses, long grape arbors, green pastures, orchards, and berry patches. Then there was the pumping plant for the artisan well and a big cement tank where Judge Miller's boys took their morning plunge and kept cool in the hot afternoon. This would mean swimming. This is a big cement tank where they would have collected water, or from a natural spring on the farm, and then you could drink in it and swim in it. So this is a big, giant plantation type area. Outhouses are bathrooms that are outside because they don't have running water. Poplars are tall trees. And if you where they talk about grooms here, it's because they have a lot of horses in the stables. One of the things to know about this farm is that you have all kinds of dogs living on the farm. So starting here, and over this great demise, Buck ruled. Here he was born, and here he lived for 4 years of his life, and it was true, there were other dogs. There could not be other dogs on so vast a place, but they did not count. They came and went, resided in the populous kennels, or lived obscurely in the recesses of the house after the fashion of Toots, the Japanese pug, or Isabel, the Mexican hairless. Strange creatures that rarely put nose out of the doors or set foot to ground. On the other hand, there were the fox terriers, a score of them, who yelled fearful promises at Toots and Isabel, looking out the windows at them and protected by a legion of housemaids armed with brooms and mops. So Buck is the family dog. You're going to see in this next chapter that everybody loves him the best. He's the king of the realm. But Buck was neither house dog nor kennel dog. The whole realm was his. He plunged into the swimming tank or went hunting with the judge's sons. He escorted Molly and Alice, the judge's daughters, on long twilight or early morning rambles. On wintry nights, he lay at the judge's feet before the roaring library fire, and he carried the judge's grandsons on his back or rolled them in the grass and guarded their footsteps through wild adventures down to the fountain in the stable yard or even beyond where the paddocks were or the berry patches. Among the terriers he stalked imperiously, and Toots and Isabel he utterly ignored, for he was king over all creeping, crawling, flying things of Judge Miller's place, humans included. I don't know if any of you have ever had a dog like this, but I have had a dog like this. And when you have a dog that has this kind of regal bearing, he takes over your entire household and becomes a part of your family. And this is what Buck's life was like. Buck's father here, Elmo, a huge St. Bernard, had been the judge's inseparable companion, and Buck bid fair to follow in a way of his father. He was not so large, he weighed only 140 pounds, for his mother Shep had been a Scotch shepherd dog. Nevertheless, 140 pounds, to which was added dignity that comes of good living and universal respect, enabled him to carry himself in a right royal fashion, and during the 4 years since his puppyhood, he had lived the life of a sated aristocrat. That means he's like really fulfilled. He had a fine pride in himself and was even a trifle egotistical, as country gentlemen sometimes become because of their insular, or this is like separated from society, situation, because they live in the country. But he had saved himself by not becoming a mere pampered or spoiled house dog. Hunting and kindred outdoor delights had kept down the fat and hardened his muscles, and to him, as to the cold, tubbing races, the love of water had been a tonic and health preserver. And this was the manner of dog Buck was in the fall of 1897, when the Klondike strike dragged men from all over the world into the frozen north. But Buck did not read the newspapers, and he did not know that Manuel, one of the garden's helpers, was an undesirable acquaintance. Manuel had one besetting sin. He loved to play Chinese lottery. Also, in his gambling, he had one besetting weakness, faith in a system, and this made his damnation certain. For to play a system requires money, while the wages of a gardener's helper do not lap over the needs of a wife and numerous progeny. So here you see that someone like Manuel, he has a lot of kids, he's married, and he has a gambling problem. That's a bad habit. So one of the things you need when you have a gambling problem is a lot of money. But unfortunately, he's only a garden's helper. The judge, the owner of the plantation and Buck's owner, was at a meeting of the Raisin Growers Association, and the boys were busy organizing an athletic club on the memorable night of Manuel's treachery. Treachery is when somebody deceives you. You put your faith in them, you trust them, and then behind your back, they go and do something dreadful. No one saw him and Buck go off through the orchard on what Buck imagined was merely a stroll, and with the exception of a solitary man, no one saw them arrive at the little flag station known as College Park. This man talked with Manuel, and the money chinked between them. At this point, there's been a lot of foreshadowing, letting you know that something terrible is going to happen. Most likely, Manuel needs money, and somehow Buck is going to help solve the situation. You might wrap up the goods before you deliver 'em, the stranger said gruffly, and Manuel doubled a piece of stout rope around Buck's neck under the collar. Twist and you'll choke 'em plenty, said Manuel, and the stranger grunted a ready affirmative or yes. Buck had accepted the rope with quiet dignity. To be sure, it was an unwanted performance, but he had learned to trust in men, and he knew, and to give him credit for wisdom or knowledge that outreached his own. But when the ends of the rope were placed in the stranger's hands, he growled menacingly. He had merely intimated his displeasure, and his pride believing that to intimate was to command. But to his surprise, the rope tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath, and in a quick rage he sprang at the man, who met him halfway, grappled him close by the throat, and with a deft twist threw him over his back. Then the rope tightened mercilessly while Buck struggled in a fury, his tongue lolling out of his mouth and his great chest panting futilely. Never in all his life had he been so vilely treated, and never in all his life had he been so angry, but his strength ebbed, his eyes glazed, and he knew nothing when the train was flagged and the two men threw him into the baggage cart. So poor Buck has utterly been betrayed at this point. He trusts Manuel because he's grown up with him and he works on the farm, but then he's sold to this man and thrown in a train car. He tries to fight back when he sees that he's being given to the stranger, but it's futile. Futile or futility means that it has absolutely no chance of happening. The next day he knew, he was dimly aware that his tongue was hurting and that he was being jolted along in some kind of conveyance. A hoarse the hoarse shriek of a locomotive or train whistling a crossing told him where he was. He had traveled too often with the judge not to know the sensation of riding in a baggage car. Excuse me. He opened his eyes, and into them came the unbridled anger of a kidnapped king. The man sprang for his throat, but Buck was too quick for him. His jaws closed on the hand, nor did they relax till his senses were choked out of him once more. "Yep, has fit," said the man, hiding his mangled hand from the baggage man, who had been attracted by the sound of the struggle. "I'm taking him up for the boss to Frisco. Crack dog doctor there thinks he can sure cure him." Concerning that night's ride, the man spoke most eloquently for himself in a little shed back of the saloon on the San Francisco waterfront. "All I get is 50 for it," he grumbled, "and I wouldn't do it over for 1,000 cold cash." His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, and the right trouser leg was ripped from knee to ankle. "How much did the other mug get?" the saloon keeper demanded. "100," was the reply. "Wouldn't take a sou less, so help me." "That makes 150," the saloon keeper calculated, "and he's worth it, or I'm a squarehead." The kidnapper undid the bloody wrappings and looked at his lacerated hand. "If I don't get the hydrophobia, that's rabies, it'll be because you were born to hang," laughed the saloon keeper. "Here, lend me a hand before you pull your freight," he added. Dazed and suffering intolerable pain from throat to tongue, with the life half throttled out of him, Buck attempted to face his tormentors, but he was thrown down and choked repeatedly till they succeeded in filing the heavy brass collar from off his neck, and the rope was removed, and he was flung into a cage-like crate. Okay, so this whole conversation here, these are all people who are trying to sell Buck. One of the reasons that I stumbled over the dialogue is because it's something called dialect, where the dialogue is written in the way that people speak. So at this point, everybody's willing to believe the man over Buck because the man speaks with authority. Buck is finally realizing that in this situation, he has no power. Let's start here. Important word for this section is wrath, which is equal to anger. There he lay for the remainder of the weary night, nursing his wrath or anger and wounded pride. He did not understand what it all meant. What did they want with him, these strange men? Why were they keeping him pent up in a narrow crate? He did not know why, but he felt oppressed by a vague sense of impending calamity. Several times during the night he sprang to his feet when the shed door rattled open, expecting to see the judge, or the boys at least. But each time it was the bulging face of the saloon keeper that peered in at him by the sickly light of a tallow candle, and each time the joyful bark that trembled in Buck's throat was twisted into a savage growl. But the saloon keeper is like somebody who owns a bar, like out in the Wild West. The saloon keeper let him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up the crate. More tormentors, Buck decided, for they were evil-looking creatures, ragged and unkempt, and he stormed and raged with them through the bars. They only laughed and poked sticks at him, and when he promptly assailed with his teeth, till he realized that that was what they wanted. Whereupon he lay down sullenly, like, he's pouting, and allowed the crate to be lifted into a wagon. Then he and the crate in which he was imprisoned began a passage through many hands. Clerks in the express office took charge of him. He was carted about in another wagon. A truck carried him with an assortment of boxes and parcels upon a ferry steamer. He was trucked off the steamer into a great railway depot, and finally he was deposited into an express car. This next paragraph here is going to talk about how Buck was transported and how angry and uncomfortable it makes him. So at this point, Buck has been taken from a life of privilege and prestige where he was treated like a king and filled with a life of love. And now he's been thrown into a situation where he's being aggressively abused on a regular basis and has no idea what's going on. For 2 days and nights, this express car was dragged along at the tail of shrieking locomotives, and for 2 days and nights, Buck neither ate nor drank. In his anger, he had met the first advances of the express messengers with growls, and they had retaliated or gotten back by teasing him. When he flung himself against the bars, quivering and frothing, they laughed and taunted him. They growled and barked like detestable dogs, and mewed and flapped their arms and crowed. It was all very silly and new, but therefore the more outrage to his dignity or pride, and his anger waxed and grew and grew. He did not mind the hunger so much, but the lack of water caused him severe suffering, and fanned his wrath or anger to a fever pitch. And for that matter, high-strung and finely sensitive, the ill treatment had flung him into a fever which was fed by the inflammation of his parched and swollen throat and tongue. He was glad for one thing: the rope was off his neck. They had given That had given them an unfair advantage, but now it was off, and he would show them. They would never get another rope around his neck. Upon that he was resolved, and for 2 days and nights he neither drank nor ate. And during those 2 days and nights of torment he accumulated or built a fund of wrath that boded ill for whoever first fell foul to him. His eyes turned bloodshot, and he was metamorphosized or changed into a raging fiend. So changed was he that the judge himself would not have recognized him, and the express messengers breathed with relief when they bundled him off the train at Seattle. The end. So, one of the things to think about before we wrap up is how much Buck has changed since he left the judge's farm. When you go forward to review this, one of the things you're going to need to do is there's a quiz. You'll see a green puzzle piece, and it's a quiz for Chapter 1, Part 1. It's a few multiple choice questions. You can always return to the reading. You have 3 chances to take the quiz if you're not happy with your score. Thank you, and I'll see you again next time. It's been a pleasure.